everybody, it's jrobichess. We're going to be covering Game 6 of the World Chess Championships. Just took place today, and of course the reigning current World Chess Champion Anand had the white pieces today against Topalov. The point total going into today's game was Anand at 3 points and Topalov at 2 points. And of course this is Game 6, so we're at the halfway point of the World Chess Championships. There's only 6 games left, so there's a whole lot of pressure on Topalov today, because if he dropped another point to Anand and he was 2 games down, it'd be pretty much all over at this point. So huge pressure with Topalov with the black pieces to hopefully win and close the gap. But of course a draw would be just as fine for Topalov today, because he would maintain just that 1 point difference in the match moving forward. But there is a little bit of a twist. Going into the second half of the World Chess Championships, they kind of flipped the order around. So Topalov again has to play with the black pieces in Game 7. So it's kind of like double the pressure. He definitely doesn't want to fall another point back with Anand in this game, but he has to come back again after their break and play with the black pieces one more time before he gets to play with the white pieces. So Topalov's definitely under a lot of pressure in this game. He's going to be under a lot of pressure again in the next game, depending on how this game shapes up. So it's definitely interesting. Now I'm just going to dive right into it here. No surprise to anybody out there in the chess world, Anand opened with pawn to d4. He's been doing really good with it against Topalov so far. In fact, the last 2 games that Topalov has had with the black pieces, Anand has been able to defeat him using the d4 opening and of course getting into the Catalan lines. So it was no surprise for anybody to see d4 from Anand today. Now I'm going to flip through the next couple moves, because it's exactly what we've seen in Game 4 and Game 2. We get into a similar kind of structure. Now we get into a little bit of a change here on move 5. So of course Anand here plays bishop up to g2 to fianchetto that, and in Game 4 Topalov tried bringing his bishop down to b4 to hit that check. And if you'll remember, we kind of got into that little struggle here, all focused around the b5 square, and then Anand dramatically changed his strategy and went for a crushing attack in the center. So in Game 4 actually he was able to defeat Topalov quite convincingly. So that was what happened in Game 4. In this game, after Anand plays his bishop up to g2, Topalov decides to continue with what he played in Game 2 by pushing his pawn up to a6. So we've seen all of these moves before in Game 2. So from here Anand continues again, knight up to e5, attacking that pawn on c4. Topalov continues now by pushing his c-pawn forward, attacking the pawn on d4, and then Anand swings his knight onto the rim of the board, which we've talked about a couple times now, and of course Topalov takes in the center, and Anand recaptures, and then from here Topalov brings his bishop back to c5, so identical to Game 2. And then castles, Topalov castles, and now we're going to get into a little bit of a shift. Back in Game 2, Anand decided to play his bishop up now to d2, and the play that followed, basically Anand was dictating the style of play, because he was kind of forcing Topalov to make a lot of reacting moves to Anand's play. He did win that game, but in this game he's decided to do something a little bit different. So we're going to go back to this position right after Topalov castled. So in this position in Game 6, Anand decides to play his bishop up now to g5. So his team must have thought that this would be an improvement compared to what he played in his previous game. From here Topalov reacts by pushing his pawn up to h6, attacking that bishop. The bishop takes the knight here on f6, and the queen comes back to recapture, and now Anand plays his knight over to d3, attacking that dark square bishop. So the bishop goes down to a7. From here Anand brings his queen up to a4, and this is an interesting move because he's kind of locking down the c6 square so that knight on b8 can't develop without the risk of losing a pawn. Now currently in the position, of course, Topalov is a pawn ahead, so Topalov could give him the pawn back, and that's actually what Topalov offers up here. He plays his knight up to c6 anyway, but Anand didn't decide to capture that knight right away. Instead he swings his rook over to c1 to start build up pressure along the c file. Now play continues from this point. Topalov pushes his pawn up to e5, so he's strengthening the pawn on d4. He's also opening up this light square diagonal for his bishop, but at the same time he's again saying to Anand, you can have a pawn if you want it. So Anand this time does come crashing into the position, snags up the knight on c6 for his light square bishop. Instead of capturing right away though, Topalov has a nice little resource in this position. He thrusts his b pawn forward up to b5, so he's forking the queen and the knight. Of course Anand has to save the queen in this position, so he drops a queen back to c2, and now Topalov grabs that bishop on c6, allowing Anand now to take that pawn and equalize the material by capturing here on e5. Of course, we've got 3 attackers on the queen, so Topalov plays his queen up now to e4. Now, I want you to take a look at this position for a couple minutes. Go ahead and pause the video if you want to, but I want you to kind of think of the pros and cons for both players. Topalov did give the pawn back, but in return, he does get a nice open diagonal from a8 all the way to h1, and of course, he's got the bishop pair in this position. The board is fairly open, so he does have those things working towards him. But I want to flip back to after the initial knight to c6 move, and I just want to take a really small look at what would have happened if Anand would have captured that knight on c6. So for example, bishop takes here on c6, the pawn has to recapture, and since the e pawn hasn't moved yet, it's still on e6, this queen can't influence the c6 square, so Anand can equalize material. So that's kind of what we talked about when I mentioned that Topalov offered up the pawn. Of course, the rook is being attacked here, so the rook would have to peel over to b8, from which Anand can bring his rook to c1, and now Topalov could kick that queen back to a4. And this is a position that I'd like you to compare with the other one that we were looking at. We have a queenside majority of pawns here for white. We've got the A and B pawns together. We do have a lot of coordination of white pieces in the area to help protect those pawns and push them up the board. But of course, it's not all rosy for white, because we have the bishop bearing down here on the b7 diagonal all the way to h1. We have the bishop pair for black. It is an open board, so it's definitely playable from both sides. There's no clear, strong advantage in this position. I'm more interested in what you would rather play in the position yourself, or what you think Anand should have played. Something about this line Anand didn't like too much, though, so he did opt to go down the lines that ended up in this position, where Topalov played his queen to e4. So I'm definitely interested in hearing your feedback on that. So from this position now, Anand continues queen up now to c6. So he's offering up the queen trade. And even though Topalov's queen on e4 doesn't have a defender, he does have a good move in this position, which is simply bishop over to b7, basically threatening checkmate if Anand were to retreat the queen. So he has to take the queen on e4. And it's a pretty good move, because if we go back to the initial move here, queen to c6, if Topalov would have tried something like queen takes right away, Anand gets to activate his rook even more by placing a rook on c6, and that's going to be difficult for black to deal with. So Topalov definitely saw the best continuation there by playing his bishop over to b7. Like I said, this forces Anand to take the queens off the table, but going down this line, Topalov gets that nice bishop on e4, so he maintains control of that light square diagonal. So quite a bit better continuation than just capturing the queen there right away and letting Anand get that rook up to c6. So from this position, play continues now. Anand lifts his rook up to c2, so he is walking into a pin willingly. Of course, we've got the knight sitting there on d3, and the bishop is pinning that down, attacking the rook there on c2 if that knight were to move. But Topalov doesn't have any resources currently that he can bring to bear to take advantage of that pin, so Anand just decides to lift his rook. From here, Topalov swings his rook over now to e8, so he is adding an attacker to the knight on e5, but Anand doesn't worry about that. He simply swings his rook over now to c1, so it's really not in Topalov's best interest to take that knight now on e5. And then now, of course, Anand has firm control over the c file, so it's going to be interesting to see how play follows, because what we're dealing with now is we're dealing with 2 knights versus 2 bishops. It's a fairly open board, so it should be pretty interesting play from this point on. From this position now, Topalov kicks that knight, so he thrusts his f-pawn to f6, attacking the knight now on e5, and Anand plays his knight over now to d7. So now we do have kind of an interesting dynamic shaping up around d3. Topalov could, if he wants to, capture that knight, making Anand capture back with the pawn, but that kind of decision would totally depend on how the play shapes up moving forward, because right now it wouldn't be in Topalov's best interest to do that. If you were to take that knight, Anand recaptures the pawn, and now that d-pawn of Topalov's is blocked. And while he does have a dark square bishop to defend that pawn, it's going to be hard for him to attack the d3 square. So instead, after seeing Anand play his knight up to d7, Topalov opts for a pretty good move, and he slides his bishop back 1 square. So he places the bishop onto f5. This is attacking the knight on d7, but at the same time, it's maintaining that really nice pin on that knight on d3. So I thought it was a pretty good move in the position that Topalov came up with. From here, Anand responds now knight over to c5. So we've got the knights supporting each other. We still have the rooks doubled up on the c file. Of course, the c2 rook is defending the e2 pawn. It is a solid position that Anand has. Definitely nothing that's leaping out in terms of attacking capabilities, but he definitely has built up a solid position to work from. So Topalov is going to have his work cut out for him if he wants to press into this position for sure. There's no doubt about that. And Topalov actually elects in this position to play bishop up to b6, possibly getting that dark square bishop ready to sit on the a5 square at some point. Of course, it's still attacking the knight on c5. I wasn't a huge fan of this move when I saw it. I figured that maybe even just capturing the knight on c5 might have worked out for Topalov, or trying to bring down the a and b pawns to kind of tangle this position up here near these rooks. But nonetheless, it's still a fine move to play in the position. Doesn't hurt his position any. And from here, Anand responds now knight to b7. So this is quite a strong move in the position because it's opening up access for the rooks, giving them the domination of the c file again, and it's also threatening attacking the d6 square with the knight, which would fork the bishop and the rook. So Topalov definitely has to do something about that, and he elects to bring his bishop to d7. So he's taking the bishop off of the f5 square, so there is no longer a pin now on that d3 knight, which lets Anand place it onto more of an active square. He plays his knight up now to f4, so the knight definitely has some options here. It's also stopping that bishop from accessing e6 to attack that a2 square, and the pawn sitting on d4 of Topalov can't really come down. Of course, the knight would just capture it, so it's pretty much frozen in the position currently. So it was a good move from Anand to get a piece more active into the position. So from here, Topalov continues rook over to b8, so he's attacking the knight now on b7, and Anand plays his knight over now to d6, attacking Topalov's rook, and Topalov plays his rook up now to e5. So he's maintaining that access along the e file for his rook, attacking that e2 square. So Anand has to keep that in mind. But of course, there is no immediate danger because his knight and his rook are already defending that square. But nonetheless, Topalov wants to keep his rook on that file. So from this position now, Anand plays knight up to c8, attacking the dark square bishop. So threatening to trade down some material. Topalov doesn't want to have anything to do with that though, and he places his bishop on a5 because he does have the bishop pair. We still have a fairly open board, so by all means, Topalov can still play for the win from this position. If Anand makes a slight positional mistake, it's all over. So from this position, Anand continues now knight over to d3, so he's attacking that rook again. Topalov swings the rook back now to e8, so that knight is in danger of being captured now. But now Topalov has enough firepower in the area that he can just outright capture it. So Anand has to retreat that knight. So he plays his knight over to a7, and Topalov's reply to this was to bring the bishop back now to b6, attacking that knight on a7, from which Anand played knight over to c6. So he is attacking the rook on b8. He's also asking Topalov to trade down some material, because Topalov, if he wanted to, could capture that knight with the light square bishop. Anand recaptures with his rook. But in the process of doing so, Anand gets a nice rook on c6 again, like we talked about earlier, and Topalov loses the bishop pair. So instead of doing that, Topalov just plays his rook up now to b7 to get it off of that b8 square. So he definitely is not looking to trade material still. From here now, Anand plays knight over to b4, so he's attacking the undefended pawn now on a6, and Topalov replies by pushing his pawn up now to a5, attacking the knight in the process. So Anand lifts his knight up now to d5, so he's attacking the dark square bishop. Once again, he's putting the question to Topalov, do you want to trade some material down? Topalov's reply this time is sure. He pushes his pawn up to a4, and Anand takes the dark square bishop now on b6, and Topalov recaptures the rook on b6. So some pieces have been liquidated, and in terms of the material balance, we're dead equal. Topalov does have that isolated pawn on the d file, but there really is no clear attacking strategy here from both players yet. So from this position, Anand plays his knight up now to c5, so he's attacking the light square bishop on d7. Topalov responds by placing the bishop back now onto f5, attacking the rook on c2. Anand plays rook over now to d2, so he's attacking that pawn now on d4, and Topalov's response to this was playing rook over now to c6. And from here, Anand plays pawn up now to b4. And I want to go back a move for a second. You might have thought to yourself, well, can Anand just grab that pawn on d4? I'm sure the black rook comes down and grabs the e-pawn, but now we don't have to worry about that isolated pawn on the d file from the white perspective. Unfortunately, if Anand were to take that pawn, it unleashes a world of hurt for white, because after that, black has a very nice move, rook over to c8. So we have two attackers now on that knight on c5. White has to defend that knight, so white would have to play rook up now to d5. That's defending the knight and attacking the light square bishop in the process. This lets black play its bishop now to g6. And from here, white has to get a defender on that knight, otherwise these rooks are married down to the defense of that knight, and that bishop is just going to be able to run wild. So white could try something like pushing the pawn up to b4, black capture. White could recapture the pawn here on b3. If white had one more move to get that pawn up to b4, it would be fine. The knight would have a defender, but unfortunately, black has a very nice resource here, which is bishop to f7. And this is a horrible move for white to me, because not only is it attacking the rook, it's also attacking the pawn sitting here on b3. The knight can't capture because then the rook falls on c1. So it's just an ugly position. White's best play here is to play the rook over now to f5, because it has to defend this knight. But from here, black has a really nice subtle move. Pawn up to g6, and it's pretty much all over for white, because white's rook can't go to any squares along this rank, has to retreat, and there goes the knight. Boom. So it would just be a horrible position for white, and it'd be a lost position actually. So rook over to c6 had some interesting trapping ideas in it, but of course we're dealing with Anand, the world chess champion, so he saw all that kind of stuff. So instead he pushes his pawn up to b4. Topalov takes that with his own pawn, and Anand recaptures, and from here now Topalov pushes his pawn up to b4. So he's preventing that b pawn of Anand's from advancing any farther. From here, Anand decides to capture the pawn now on d4, so that lets Topalov capture the pawn on e2, but now Anand gets the pawn on b4 as well. So, you know, Topalov is down a pawn in the position, but it's going to be a very hard pawn to maintain because black has some good piece activity here. So from this position, actually, Topalov swings his bishop to h3, so he's kind of nailing that king shut there on the g and h1 squares, and Anand replies rook over now to c4. So basically letting him bring his knight back into the game because the knight's no longer pinned. From this position, Topalov swings his rook over now to d6, getting ready to bring that rook down to d2, and Anand continues now rook over now to e4. So he's basically offering Topalov the option to trade the rooks off. Topalov says no way, not interested, plays his rook over to b2, so he's going to start to build up the attack on that b3 square along with the f2 square once his other rook comes down into the position, and Anand plays it safe and pulls his rook back down now to e1. So from here, Topalov continues. He does bring the rook down to d2, so we do have two attackers now on the f2 square, and Anand's reply to that is he swings his knight over now to e4, so it's defending the pawn on f2, and it's also attacking Topalov's rook. Topalov pulls the rook back now to d4, and then places the knight back exactly where it was before, and Topalov pushes his rook back again. So we do have a repeat in the position, but from here now, instead of bringing the rook back up to d4, Topalov pushes the rook up now to d3. So we have two attackers on that pawn, and Anand actually swings his rook over to b1. Topalov ignores that, just takes that pawn up now, and Anand doesn't capture the rook right away. Instead, he swings his knight down to d2, attacking Topalov's rook. Topalov moves his rook up one square to b4, and now Anand plays pawn up to f3. And this is kind of a good move because it's giving his king access to the f2 square at some point, so it's no longer completely hemmed into the g and h1 squares, and it's also taking away the bishop's scope here on g4 if Topalov were to try to bring the bishop up and influence any action going on here. So from this position, Topalov pushes his pawn up now to g5, and Anand replies by taking the rook now, so he's taking the rook off the table. Topalov, of course, recaptures, and from here Anand places his rook now onto d1. So now all of a sudden we can see why Anand wanted to take away the bishop's scope from the g4 square, because now he can let that rook sit there to defend that knight. So from this position, Topalov continues king up to f7, so he's going to bring his king closer to the action, and Anand replies in kind and places his king onto f2, and play continues. Topalov now pushing his pawn up now to h5, and Anand replies by bringing his king even closer to the center of the board, plays his king up to e3, so now the king is defending the knight. Of course, they're on dark squares, so this light square bishop can never impede upon these pieces, and from here Topalov plays rook over to c2. And in fact, I'm just going to kind of flip through the remainder of the moves, because since that king and knight can't be impacted by that light square bishop, there's really not a lot of action in this position, and in fact the game ends in a draw. So it was a draw, not as dramatic as a win, of course, but for Topalov, it was dramatic because Topalov has now stopped the Anand crush in terms of losing against Anand with the black pieces. So he's able to draw the game, but we have to remember that the pressure isn't going to let up on Topalov because due to the way they've scheduled the second half of the match, he gets the black pieces one more time. So it's 2 games in a row that he has with the black pieces. If he loses outright to Anand in the next game, he's going to drop 2 full points down in the standings, and when you're only dealing with 5 games left after that, that's going to be a pretty tough stretch to get back, especially when you're talking about playing the world chess champion Anand. So the point total after 6 games, Anand 3.5 points, Topalov 2.5 points, and we'll see what happens in game 7. So take care, hope you enjoy the video, and we'll see you next time.